This is a complete assembly and shell swap instructional video for any X20 Tandem Series transmitters. We're going to get you from any previous color you may have had to this new Cardinal Red. Or you can simply treat it as an assembly guide. To complete this task, you'll need heat shrink tubing, solder, a flux pen, a 1.5mm hex, a Phillips head screwdriver, scalpels, spudgers, tweezers, wire strippers, scissors, and some sticky tape. The final step will require you clamping down your screen for 24 hours, so you're going to need an assortment of clamps. You don't have to be very excessive with the pressure of the clamps, and anything will do. If you decide to add new switches, you'll require a soldering station. Try and use a high quality one, otherwise life becomes very difficult. Alongside the soldering station, you're going to want to use a little holder to hold your switches and wires in place. The more stable you can get your components, the better solder joint you will make. It's also very handy to have a little stand. If you are shell swapping, this is what a new shell kit looks like. You get the front cover, the back cover, the LCD cover, a dial, and a few hinges. What you will notice is the central slider switch is now black instead of red. When FrSky introduced the new series X20s in the Cardinal Red, they also changed the switches. They changed from the original round head to the flathead switches. I'm going to show you how to convert to those flathead switches in this video as well. In order to get the best success, you'll need the following: two 2.4 GHz antennas, an LCD digitizer, two switch wire connectors, a new speaker, a new flathead switch set, one set of pots, one set of sliders, and one set of switch gaskets, and optionally, if you want, a new 900 MHz antenna. As I mentioned in my first teardown video, I never reuse parts that have adhesive or glue on them, hence the reason why we have the screen, the new 2.4 GHz and new speaker. Whether using new switches or replacing the original ones, it is absolutely vital to put the switches in the correct position, meaning you've got to get the correct color top wire, otherwise you will have issues with your switches. There'll be a link in the description, refer to it when installing switches. To give you the intuition, here is what the switch mapping looks like, and you'll notice with switch A the top wire is white, switch B the top wire is blue, switch E the top wire is green, etc. I'll go through the whole switch mapping so you get the exact idea of how to install or replace the switches when it comes time to putting in the new switches. I cannot stress enough how important it is to put those switches in the correct position. The switch table is also really important if you're soldering new wires. It'll tell you top, middle and bottom wires when the switch is in the up position. Okay, we're going to begin the assembly by soldering the switch wire connectors to the switches, the sliders and the pots. Prepare your soldering station by setting the soldering to 320 and the heat gun to 200 degrees Celsius respectively. It's a good idea to pre-cut your heat shrink tubing. You'll need 35 1cm pieces. Go ahead and cut those pieces out now, and we'll move on to soldering the switches. To begin the soldering process, position the first switch you're going to solder into your holder with the switch dialed right up. That is top, middle and bottom wire terminals. The switch wire connectors come pre-tinned and need no prepping. So the next step is to add the flux to the wire terminals. Be liberal with the flux. A lot of flux usually ends up in a nice solder joint. At this stage, you should have your wire referencing chart in front of you. With the switch position up, decide which is going to be the top, middle and bottom wire, and begin to tin the leads in preparation for soldering the wires onto the terminals. To tin the leads, heat up some solder onto your soldering iron and simply run the solder over the terminal very lightly, very quickly. You only need a little thin film of solder on each terminal, and that's enough to create the solder joint that you need to connect the wire nice and snug onto the terminal. You don't need big blobs of solder. You'll notice just a quick little fast motion coats each terminal quite nicely. Next, you're going to preload the shrink tube behind each wire that you're going to solder. In this case, I'm going to be soldering white on the top, black in the middle, red on the bottom. Again, I stress, make note of the switch position and the top wire. Once you've installed the heat shrink tubing, you are ready to make your first solder, or solder joint as the Americans say. Now take your time to position the wire nice and square and level onto the first terminal before you make your solder. Once in position, add a little solder onto the tip of your iron and gently touch over the wire in a quick and fast motion, and that should solder the wire onto the terminal nicely. Just a quick aside, never add a naked soldering iron onto a joint. Always have a bit of solder, otherwise you're going to have great difficulty melting the solder already tinned. Position your second wire, in my case it's the black wire, and begin the process again. Hit a little bit of solder onto your soldering iron, make a quick fast motion and make that solder joint, soldering the black wire onto the middle terminal. Once satisfied, repeat the process for the red wire, and again, with this fast sweeping motion on a pre-soldered soldering iron, make that solder joint. Your soldering joints don't have to be Picasso's, it's just as long as the wire is connected to the terminal, and once you've done that, position your heat shrinking tubes and heat them and shrink them into place. Remembering that we set the heat gun to around about 200 degrees Celsius, go ahead and just lightly sweep over those heat shrink tubes and they will shrink nicely and coat the soldered wires. Go ahead and do that now, and remember, fast sweeping motions. You never really want to hold the heat gun in one position for too long. Once the shrink tubing has fully shrunk into place, you have completed the first switches soldering. Using your reference guide, go ahead and repeat the process until all of your switches, pots and sliders have been successfully soldered onto your new switch connection cables. Now that we've soldered the switches, it's time to install them onto our new shell. Before we do this, it's important to understand how the switches are installed. You'll notice that the circled item is the gasket. The groove of the gasket sits on top of the groove on the shell, and that aligns the switch. So what you're going to do is you're going to sandwich the gasket into the switch and then install it. Once installed, you'll fasten it down with a top nut. But before we get there, go ahead and remove the top nut and install all the gaskets onto all of the switches in preparation for installation. If you've decided not to solder and to just simply swap the original switches, you can ignore this section and simply move on to installing the switches. Okay, using your reference guide, get switch A, put it into position and begin installing it. The same with switch B. You'll notice with switch A and switch B, we've got the white wire and the blue wire consecutively at the top. So begin doing that and follow through until all of the switches have been installed. Take your time, make sure that the gaskets are flush on the switch and the gasket is hitting the groove of the shell. That way, all your switches will move in concert and parallel to each other, which is what you want. Make sure that when you're installing the top nut, you're using the toggle switch tool. Don't over tighten the top nut, but then again, don't leave it loose either. You want a nice firm hold. Once you've completed installing all 4 switches, you can move on to the sliders and pots. As you go ahead and install the sliders and pots, make sure that all your wires are untangled. The sliders simply slot into the side groove and the pots attach on very similar to the switches. There is a top nut, however there's no gasket required for the pot switch. To make sure that you've installed the pot the correct way, the left wire should be red, the middle wire should be yellow, and the right wire should be black. Likewise with the slider, top red, mid yellow, bottom black. If that's how it looks, you've done it correctly. Once you're confident, lock in the pot nut and begin starting the installation of the switches on the other side of the transmitter. As you begin installing the switches on the other side of the transmitter, be sure to take the time and use the reference guide to make sure that you're putting the correct switch in the correct slot. Also, now is your chance. If you wanted to swap the momentary switch from the left hand side to the right hand side, you're free to do that. It won't affect the programming of the transmitter in any way. I actually did that and prefer it. Likewise, repeat the process for installing the slider and the pot for the other side of the transmitter. Go ahead and complete that now. It should take you quite a bit of time, but don't rush. Once again, I'll emphasize using the toggle switch tool and not a screwdriver, otherwise you will scratch your shell. The final step in order to complete the installation of the switches, sliders and pots is to get all of the messy wiring and make it nice and neat. And to do that, you're going to twist the switch wire connector so that all those cables consolidate into one thick cable, and then you're going to wrap that cable around the furthest screw hinge. This is exactly how the switch wire connectors should be seated in the transmitter. You're going to do the same thing for the other side, and then you'll be ready to move on to the next step. Here is a final look on how the switch wire connectors should be seated and positioned in your transmitter. Now that you've installed all of your switches, sliders and pots, it's time to test their alignment to make sure that they're all moving in concert, they're parallel to each other and they're not wonky or crooked. If you find some of the switches aren't symmetrical or parallel, it's more than likely that the switch has moved when you've installed it and the gasket's been misaligned from the switch. Go back and straighten them until you're happy. You'll note with the pot switches that there's a little indent in the center position. Be sure to turn the dials into the center position so that you can install the turning knob for each pot. Once you've done that, you'll also slide on the slider caps on the left and right slider dials. The turning dial of the pot switch, they are quite easy to install. You simply need to loosen the hex nut on the side of the dial, insert it, and then tighten the hex nut with a 1.5mm hex nut screwdriver. Go ahead and do that now. That shouldn't take you too long. Just double check to make sure that you have those hex nuts quite firmly tightened so that you don't get any slippage on your turning pots. Once you're confident you've installed them, test the turning knobs, turn them all the way to the left and all the way to the right to make sure that they are reaching full range and they are aligning with the markings on the actual shell. At center position, knob line and shell line should be synced up and in the same position. Moving on to the slider caps, they are very easy to install. You just simply slide them into place. It's impossible to get it wrong because the way it's shaped, there's only one way they can be inserted. So go ahead and do that now. Once you've installed the slider caps, just give them a little slide up and down to make sure that everything's okay. Once you're happy with switch, pot and slider positioning, we can move on to the next stage of the assembly, and that will be installing the speaker. This is very simple. All you simply do is peel back the adhesive, and the way you install it is you will have the red wire facing the top right hand side and the black wire on the bottom. Once you've set the speaker in place, just push it down a few times to make sure the adhesive fastens and the speaker stays in place. Once that speaker is firmly in place, we can move on to installing the two 2.4 GHz antennas. You'll notice on the top and on the left of the LCD screen are two cutouts. That is where the antennas are housed. To prepare the switch to be installed, remove the adhesive cover so that the adhesive is exposed. Once you've done that, Insert the top 2.4 gigahertz antenna, wire in first, and then seat it into place and apply pressure so the adhesive sticks to the shell. You're going to position the adhesive to the top part of the recess. Take your time, make sure it's well seated and it's gripped well. It's very important that you seat these in the right position to make sure that they are level, they are square, and they are well stuck in. Otherwise, you're going to have issues with your transmitter binding with any type of receiver in the future. We're going to do the same now for the left-hand 2.4 gigahertz second antenna. We're going to remove the adhesive, insert it wire first, and then apply pressure to make sure that the adhesive is actually facing the outer left part of the recess. The wire will be facing down towards the transmitter as you're placing the 2.4 gig antenna. Once again, take your time, be patient, and make sure that that antenna adhesive has gripped well to the left side of the shell. And that is, it is correctly positioned and nice and flush. Once you've installed the antennas, turn the transmitter over to inspect whether the antennas are well placed. It should look like this. Now it's time to prepare the LCD digitizer assembly for installation. This involves bending and shaping the flex cables of the LCD digitizer. Doing a side-by-side comparison, you'll notice that the larger flex cable has 3 folds in it and it kinks like a wave. Here is a side view of what it looks like once it's properly been prepared and installed. Similar for the thinner flex cable, it too has been bent into a wavy S shape. Here is a side view to give you an idea on what the flex cable should look like. Here are the lengths at where the folds have been made. You need to create that on your flex cable. So what you're going to do is you're going to mark it out with a Sharpie so you know exactly where to make the folds. So starting with the longer cable, I'm marking at 7mm, 14mm and 20mm. Likewise, on the thinner flex cable, I'll be measuring and marking out at 6mm and at 10mm to make the folds. When folding the large flex cable, start with the middle fold at the 14mm point and you're going to bend it upwards. To fold and shape the flex cable, use some type of cylindrical rod. I used a metal rod in this case. You could also use the shaft of a screwdriver. The key here is to be gentle and to fold softly. Don't crease it like origami, just gently fold and shape. What you don't want to do is create creases or really marked out folds. Just keep repeating the gentle folding again and again until the flex cable finally takes shape. On the large flex cable, at the 7mm point and at the 20mm point, you want to bend the opposite direction to what you did at the 14mm mark. So you're going to be bending the flex cable down and not up. You want to create a wave or a U bend. I've left the original LCD on the blue transmitter to show you exactly what shape you want to achieve with your flex cable. It's like a U. Again, this is not a quick process. Don't rush. Take your time. It's shaping more than it is folding. The trick here is to just repeat the folding technique until the flex cable finally begins to take shape. A kink in the flex cable is needed because of the length of the flex cable compared to where it sits on the LCD driver board. The flex cable itself is a little bit longer, so you need that kink to cut the distance. Now moving on to the thinner flex cable, this one is a little bit more forgiving. You're going to start with the 10mm mark and you're going to gently fold that upwards. Because it was a smaller cable, I used a thin screwdriver to make the fold. Like before, be gentle, repeat the process until the flex cable takes shape, just like the big flex cable did. Once you've completed the upward fold at the 10mm mark, you're going to fold the opposite downward way at the 6mm mark, so you create that wavy S shape in the flex cable. Go ahead and complete that and take your time. Once you complete, you should have something that looks a little bit like this. It doesn't have to be as pronounced so long as the kinks hold and remain in shape when installing the LCD to the LCD driver board. Before we go and do that, we need to first temporarily fix our screen onto the transmitter. Do not pull the LCD adhesive tabs off yet. Feed the flex cables through the slot marked with a circle and fix the LCD onto the transmitter. At this point it will be loose, nothing's holding it down. Once the screen is correctly positioned, we can move on to temporarily holding it onto the transmitter. We're going to fix the screen onto the transmitter temporarily using sticky tape. So cut 3 or 4 pieces of sticky tape and stick them around the perimeters of the screen so that screen stays in place. Go ahead and do that now and make sure that screen is nice and firm and not loose in any way, because that could cause damage to the flex cables. As you can see, I just used 1 piece of tape for each side of the screen, and that was ample to keep it in place. Now we're ready to install the LCD driver board. With the transmitter positioned upside down and towards you, place the LCD board with the switch tabs face down so that you can commence connecting the flex cables all the way up to the white indicator line, and then switching the tabs and locking those flex cables into place. When locking the tabs in place, be gentle. They are quite fragile and break easily. Notice the kink on the large flex cable. As with both flex cables, they are slightly longer than the distance between the flex to the connector, hence you need the kink to shorten the space and match the distance to the connector. Take your time installing the flex cables. Be very careful not to tug and pull on them, because they can be damaged very easily. Once you're done, test that your connections are square and flush, and if you're happy, you can move on. Turning our attention to the top 2.4 GHz antenna, what you will notice is that the coaxial white cable is not long enough to simply tuck around the edge of the frame and then be long enough to fit the RF connector board. So the solution to the problem is to feed that top RF coaxial cable underneath the LCD driver board before you fasten the driver board into its final position in the transmitter. The driver board is held down by 2 tabs. Simply angle in sideways the LCD driver board under the one tab, and then gently pull the other tab out and push down on the LCD driver board, and that should pop and click into place. Now it's time to install the RF antenna and LCD bracket. That's quite simple. Position it over the top of the 2 hinges it seats in. Make sure your wires are in a nice neat position, and simply put that bracket in place in preparation for screwing the 2 screws it requires to be fastened onto the transmitter. On the top left of the screen, I include a little schematic of how and where the screws are placed. So go ahead and put those screws in and fasten that bracket. If you are using a new shell, you may find that the screws are very, very tight initially when you screw them in. That's natural. They may need a little bit more pressure than usual to screw in. So don't let the need of a little bit more pressure fear or worry you. Once the support bracket has been installed, it's time to put the back LCD shell cover on. You'll notice two tabs on the top lip of the cover. Angle it at 45 degrees into the top of the shell and add a little bit of pressure on each tab, on the top one and on the bottom one. You'll notice that I add circles and show you where I applied pressure. You'll hear a slight click and you'll know that the LCD back shell has been fastened correctly in position. Now you're ready to screw the back LCD cover into place. Once again, a little schematic on the top left. All you need to simply do is apply those two screws into the sockets, and that LCD cover is safe and fastened onto the transmitter, ready for you to progress on to the next step. Go ahead with that, and next we'll begin installing the logic boards onto the transmitter. The first board we're going to install is the keyboard. So grabbing the keyboard, put it in place and be careful not to obstruct the speaker cable and the haptic engine cable that is on the left of the keyboard. If you've positioned the board correctly, it should look a little something like this. Now, holding the keyboard in place with your 4 fingers, turn the transmitter around and test that all the buttons and sliders are correctly positioned and are operating correctly. If you need to make any minor adjustments to the position of the keyboard, now is the time to do it. Once you're satisfied that the keyboard is in the correct position, it's time to screw the 7 screws that hold that in place. Again, a schematic on the top left to give you the screw positions. Go ahead and add those screws in now. Now that the keyboard has been fastened, it's time to attach the haptic engine into the left groove. You're going to position the top wires as close as you can to the keyboard so that the wires are parallel to the actual keyboard itself. Make sure that's nice and tight and snugly fit. Now that everything on the underside of the keyboard has been fastened, we will turn the transmitter over and we will install the central slider, the ring dial bearing and the circular dial onto the transmitter. In the new shell kits, you do receive a bearing, however it is inferior to the original one. I used my original bearing, which has actually got ball bearings and not just a smooth plastic ring. So go ahead and install that and make sure that's fit in tight, nice and square. Test that the bearing is doing its job and it's spinning smoothly, and once you've done that, install the circular switch on the right. Give the switch a little turn and a little press to make sure that everything's okay. Once you're satisfied with that, we can move on to installing the gimbals. Like the majority of us, I'll be installing the gimbals in the Mode 2 configuration. Before installing the gimbal, you need to install the support ring. Notice the true north and true south. They need to be aligned correctly. And FrSky have cleverly done so by using indents to where the screw hinges are on the transmitter. So you can easily fit that ring on and make sure that it's in the correct position. So go ahead and install that ring by moving any wires out of the way and carefully placing the support ring in its place. Once installed, turn the transmitter over and make sure that it's sitting in the correct position. it should look a little something like this. Turning the transmitter over, don't forget left becomes right and right becomes left. So install your first gimbal, which technically will be the right gimbal when you look at your controller. For mode 2, the gimbal will be the one that re-springs, which will be positioned on the left hand side. So go ahead and position the gimbal. If you have any personal preferences to gimbal positions, now's the time to make the adjustments. And to the top left is the schematics for the 4 screws that fasten the gimbal into its position. You'll notice from the schematics that the holes for the screws are quite wide. That allows you to pivot the gimbal and is what I was referring to when mentioning making minor adjustments. That adjustment is particularly good for all those thumbers out there. Once you have fastened all 4 gimbal screws, turn the transmitter over and give the sticks a little test. So repeat the exact procedure and install the second gimbal on the right hand side. The process is identical, so I will zip through this section very fast. Again, you're going to seat the ring in the correct position. Turn the transmitter over to ensure that the ring has been put in the correct position. You're going to position your gimbal. Then fasten the gimbal with the 4 screws, making any minor pivotal adjustments. And then turning the transmitter over and giving those sticks a test to make sure that they're working properly. Once that's complete, next on the list are the trim switches and the PWR board installation. In order to install the trim switches correctly, we have to pay close attention to the PWR board. You'll notice 2 diagonal holes where each rocker switch sits on the PWR board. Given there's 4 trim switches, we need to pay attention to those 4 diagonals before we install the trim switches. Otherwise, the trim switches won't sit flush in the transmitter. Taking a closer look at the trim switch, you'll see the 2 plastic protruding pins that are in a diagonal. You need to match this diagonal. So one by one, line up where the pins of the trim switch go in comparison to where the holes are on the PWR board, and install each trim switch one by one, making reference to the PWR board. If you put the trim switch on the wrong way, the PWR board will not fasten down and the trim switches will not work at all. So just as what I'm doing, line up the holes and place each trim switch in its correct position until all 4 trim switches have been installed. Now that the 2 vertical and 2 horizontal trim switches have been housed, we can position the PWR board and seat it correctly by placing the board on the diagonal protruding pins. It will sit nicely. On the top left corner is a schematic of where the screw goes for the PWR board. Once the PWR board is housed properly, it's time to install the 6 screws. Don't forget 2 of them are under the FPC cable, so go ahead and do that now. Now that you've screwed in the PWR board, turn the transmitter over and test if all the trim switches and the power button are working correctly. They should be clicking nice and clean, and there should be no issues or obstructions. Once satisfied all is well, move on to connecting all of the cables for the gimbals and the switch sets. The 2 bottom horizontal ones are for the gimbals and the 2 top vertical ones are for all of the switches, pots and sliders. When installing each connector, try and avoid grabbing them by the wires. Instead, try and grip the rectangular switch and carefully, gently place it on top of the connector and push down with either a spudger or with some slight pressure on your finger. Manipulating these switches by the wires really runs the risk of damaging a wire or damaging a connection to the wires and cause havoc for you later on. So be extra cautious and try and grab the rectangular connector as best you can, avoiding touching the wires. It's also good to remember that there's no rush. Take your time in doing things. Go ahead and complete that task and we move on to the next task. Next, we are going to connect the LCD FPC cable on the top part of the PWR board. And once we've done that, we're going to move on to the bottom FPC cable, which connects the keyboard to the PWR board. So go ahead and do that now. Remembering that the tabs are very delicate, be gentle, take your time, and make sure that you insert the cables all the way in. Once you've completed fastening the bottom keyboard FPC cable, be sure that the speaker JST connector isn't trapped anywhere because you need to install that next. Make sure that cable is free and accessible. Now it's time to position the main board by lining up the two white connectors on the top of the PWR board to the two on the bottom of the main board. Gently insert the main board on an angle, line the connectors up and push down. Once the main board is on correctly, it will be stable and it won't wobble. Here is a schematic of the main board's screws. Make careful note here that each screw size is different for each level of the main board. The bottom screws are the longest and thinnest screws. Go ahead and insert them now. The middle row screws are the ones that have a washer, and the top two screws are the smallest. Install them now as well. Take a final quick look to make sure everything's housed properly. Once satisfied, we're now going to connect the JST speaker connector to the main board. Again, don't grab this connector by the wires, grab it by the plastic casing around the wires. Position that casing in place and then push the case into the socket with either your finger or a spudger. In my case, I kind of use a combination of both. Sometimes they're tricky to install. Now the speaker's connected, we can move on to connecting the RF and the external CON board. The way to do this is very straightforward. You'll notice on the bottom of the main board there is a black connector. You're going to match that connector with the one on the bottom of the RF board and you're going to clip them into place. Don't use too much force, they slide in quite nicely. Make sure that you've seated the boards correctly and you can move on. Here is a schematic of the screws, fasteners and spacers required. This bit is by far the most difficult to screw in, but there's an easy way to get around it. Starting with the two bottom screws, you'll identify them as the ones having the largest head. Begin by only half screwing this into the board. This allows a little bit of give so you can insert the spacer in between the external connectivity board and the RF board. Go ahead and half screw the other side of that bottom screw. Now grab your spacer and wedge it in between the top right screw socket of the external CON board. Once in place, tighten the bottom right hand screw to keep the spacer in place. Now you're going to get the longest screws out of this parts screw set and insert them into the top right hand corner of the external connectivity board first. Don't tighten it all the way, tighten it 3/4 because you still need some give to install the spacer on the left hand side. Repositioning the transmitter, you can see when I push down on the external connectivity board, there's a little bit of spring to it. That's what you want. Now grab the left spacer and place it into the top left position in between the external CON board and the RF board. Once in place, push down and insert the screw in the top left part of the external CON board to fasten it down. Once you've done this, go ahead and finish tightening all the screws around the external connectivity board until they are nice and tight. Now that the external CON board has been fastened down tightly, you can now install the two top screws of the RF board to complete the installation of these two boards. Now it's time to connect all the antenna cables onto the RF board. Starting from the left, the first antenna cable is the right external antenna. Position the head of the coaxial cable to the socket and gently push down. When installed properly, you'll feel a clicking or a popping as you connect that cable. Once connected, give it a little wobble up and down to make sure the connection is secure. The second coaxial cable to be installed is the left-hand side 2.4 GHz antenna. That goes in position number 3, counting from the left. Again, taking your time and being very soft and gentle, connect that coaxial cable into the third socket position of the RF board. The fourth position on the RF antenna is housed by the right external antenna. Once again, gently and carefully position the coaxial cable head and push it down and click it into place. Just like with all the RF wires, again, to ensure that the connection is solid, just wobble the cable up and down and it should stay and pivot in the socket. The furthest right or last socket on the RF board is for the top 2.4 GHz antenna. Like the previous, connect it now and test that you properly connected it by giving it a wobble. At this point, all the coaxial RF cables should be connected except for the one in position 2. And it should look something like this. Next, tuck all the RF coaxial wires behind the RF board as best you can so they don't obstruct any other wires or components. Okay, now we move on to tackling the back cover and in particular installing the 900 MHz handle antenna onto the back case. Simply position the antenna and push it through the left and the right hand slots. It's a very snug fit, so it might take a little bit of pressure, but don't be afraid. With the 900 MHz antenna handle in place, what we're going to do now is we're going to fasten the handle down by installing the spacer and the 4 screws required to hold the handle in place. It looks like this. The small screw goes on the top and the long screw goes on the bottom. So go ahead and install those spacers and screws now. Once you've put all screws in place and the handle is fastened, the next step is to install the back cover to the transmitter. To do that, grab the back cover and put it at a 90-degree angle at the top of the transmitter. This allows you to connect the last antenna, the 900 MHz coaxial cable. Go ahead and install that cable now, the same way you did all the other RF cables, and making sure that the connection is snug and tight. Now that you've done that, you can put the back cover onto the transmitter and begin fastening it so you can screw the back cover on. You may experience a little difficulty around the sliders. That is because the slider grooves have grooves on the bottom and on the back lid. So take your time around those two areas and make sure that the plastic side grips are over and attached properly. Take your time and inspect that the back cover is fastened on neatly and snugly, and once you've done that, you're ready to fasten the back cover onto the rest of the shell. The back cover is held down by 4 Phillips head screws. So begin now screwing in each screw one by one, making sure that they are nice and tight because you don't want any gap in between the seal of the front shell and the back shell. It needs to be a nice, tight fit. Once it feels like all the screws are in, go around diagonally again and you'll find that there's a little bit more gap to tighten the screws a little bit more. You really want a tight fit. Keep repeating until you're satisfied, and when you are, you can proceed to putting in the battery and the battery door cover. Installing the battery is quite straightforward. The only advice I give is do not pull or push with the wires. Use the plastic plug and use either a spudger or tweezers to push the plug into the socket. It is a very tight fit. Carefully position the wires correctly, insert the battery, and attach the back battery door. The hard work is done. However, there are two more very important steps to take. The first is to turn on the transmitter so you can test your LCD and digitizer. If you recall, we've only temporarily fixed that screen in case there was some type of fault. If you had removed the adhesive, you would have voided your warranty. So now's the time to test your screen to see if everything is okay. While here, test all your sliders, dials, knobs, sticks to make sure that everything is working correctly. Be methodical when you're testing all of the switches and functions. If all the steps were followed correctly, you should have no issues, but if you do, now's the time to troubleshoot. Once you're confident with everything, turn the screen off because we will be preparing to fasten the LCD permanently. To do this, first remove the sticky tape that is holding the screen temporarily, allowing the screen to be loose again because we're going to need to lift the screen to be able to access the adhesive protective tabs. So go ahead now and remove all the sticky tape that's holding the screen down. With nothing supporting the screen, you're now free to lift it so that we can pull off the adhesive safety tabs. Be very gentle when you lift and manipulate the screen, and be sure to remove all 4 tabs from the perimeter of the screen. Be very careful, I cannot stress it enough. So with a pair of tweezers, just grab the tabs and pull them off one by one. Once all the adhesive is exposed, carefully seat the screen in its recess and put some slight pressure on it to hold it in place. Take your time lining up the position of the screen. Once you're happy with where the screen is, push down so that the adhesive catches and holds the screen in place. The next step after this is to clamp the screen for 24 hours. But before we start clamping, let's put the side grips on and let's put the switch covers on the switches. Now that we've prettied up the transmitter with the grips and the little covers on the switches, it's time to clamp the screen for 24 hours. As mentioned at the beginning of the video, you do not need very much pressure to clamp the screen. Minimal pressure is all you need, and the idea is to pressure around the perimeter of the screen and as much of the perimeter as possible. These hand clamps are great. They seem to do the job really well, except for the bottom part of the screen. That's where you're probably going to need a C-clamp, like the following. Be very careful with the C-clamps. Very, very minimal pressure, and be very careful where you place the clamp itself. I recommend you turn on your LCD while you clamp, because if you have applied too much pressure, you will notice light bleed on your LCD. So that guides you into applying the correct amount of pressure when you're clamping. All you have to do now is wait 24 hours. After the 24-hour period has elapsed, turn your transmitter on and test all switches and functions one more time. Hopefully, all should be well. If you've made it this far, congratulations, you have successfully shell swapped or assembled a very complex transmitter. Well done, and thank you for watching. If you have any questions, I will be more than happy to answer them in the comments. Let me know. Good luck and thank you for watching my video.